Hello, I'm Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Russia's International Investment Bank is moving to Hungary. It's been called Putin's Trojan horse. We find out what Orban's thinking and why the West is concerned. Also this week, as the global economy slows, populist governments are threatening the independence of central banks. Plus, India's second largest airline runs out of money. We ask, does Jet Airways have a future? Our money looking for a route out of Russia and into the European Union appears to have found a crack in the banking system. Tens of billions of dollars has been laundered through mostly Baltic nations, swamping the outposts of Nordic banks. It's been an ongoing headache for European regulators. Now, a different issue entirely has raised the anxiety levels in European capitals. Russia plans to move the headquarters of its development bank to Hungary. We'll get into that in a moment. But first, let's get to grips with the scale of this money laundering problem and some of the numbers behind it. Around $1 trillion has been moved out of Russia over the last 25 years by individuals and companies. Not all illicit, but that's money that has not returned to the country. Other sources of the money include Moldova and Azerbaijan. The money has been moved via Malta, Cyprus, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. In the biggest money laundering case, $230 billion was transferred through the Danske Bank's Estonian branch between 2007 and 2015. Where did that money go? Into London's property market, Britain's offshore tax havens, villas in the south of France and Spain. As the investigation has continued, it's drawn in banks across Europe. Now, having failed to stem the money laundering, Europe has another dilemma. How does it respond to Viktor Orban's decision to allow Moscow to move its development bank to Budapest? While the bank is in its infancy and Hungary has a minority stake, it has no say in the way the bank is run. It would effectively have diplomatic immunity, so regulators would not be able to monitor it. Well, joining me via Skype from Bratislava in Slovakia is Julius Horvath, economics professor at the Central European University in Budapest. Thanks very much for being with us. So why does Viktor Orban want this bank in his country then?
It's basically an answer to this question basically needs to be quite complicated because it really reflects changes in Central European countries' strategical thinking. And that happens also in Warsaw, maybe also in Prague or Bratislava, and definitely in Budapest. And Hungary in the last 3-4 years actually is emphasizing the weakness of Western Europe, of opening towards the East, improving relationship with the more dynamic part of the world, and things like that. And this is one of those. So it's improving relation with Russia, which is already on for a couple of years. Russian atomic energy company Rosatom got a very influential contract for building nuclear reactors in Hungary. And this is one of those continuation of this type of policies.
It's curious, though, because this bank would be the 17th largest in Hungary. It doesn't appear to have the money for big projects, does it?
Yes, I think that you're correct. So this is a bank which was founded in a Soviet era, in a kind of, late 1960s, early 1970s, when the Soviets tried to, in one or other way, to modernize. And actually the bank was to support competition for loans, or things like that, which was very difficult to implement in the Soviet planning system. But the bank survived the 1990s. It was not closed. It kind of, people lost relatively interest. It is a bank with a small volume of capital. And if I remember correctly, even Hungary left this bank during the current prime minister's first office in the late 1990s. But then, during the President Putin, bank began to be rejuvenated, invigorated maybe 10 years ago, and began to be more seen internationally. In Bratislava, especially, it's opened in 2015 a regional office. It increased the membership to, I believe, 9 countries. Yeah, so but definitely it provides loans in the volume of 20, 30 million dollars or euros, which on the global scale or even regional scale is not a substantial, economic important step.
So basically, what is the purpose of this bank? Is it like China's development bank?
Yes, it is to have a good relation with Russia, to help Russians, maybe to ease some of the sanctions, because maybe some people can come to the bank who will be protected by immunity and having diplomatic status, which otherwise would be difficult to travel. So, this type of gesture, I think I see in it a political gesture predominantly. It has also economic impact, but its economic impact is small, and it is in the news maybe, because of the political impact. But it's difficult to see through, from the university or from some cathedra. But most likely, this is the fact.
The opposition is calling this Putin's Trojan horse, if you like, because it gives the Russians this unprecedented opportunity to enter the EU through this route. And the argument goes that this creates a serious national security concern. Is that a legitimate concern, do you think?
Well, that's typically only time, will answer this question. So Russians are imperium, a very large country. They know a lot of ways how to move across borders. This is a very elegant way how to move in Hungary, in the country where government is very friendly actually to the Russian economic interest. But on the other hand, still Hungary is a member of NATO and is a member of European Union, and it's a huge German economic interest, for example, also. So I don't think it's a decisive step which changes, a political picture. It's some small sign, towards strengthening the good relation with the eastern countries, especially with Moscow.
Julius Horvath, good to speak with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Still to come on Counting the Cost, 16,000 jobs on the line as Jet Airways grounds flights. Our neoliberal economies love to talk up independent central banks. Free of political interference, these banks have been able to raise and lower rates to curb inflation and boost growth. But a populist trend has emerged that threatens their free hand. President Trump, who has regularly attacked his pick for US Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, said the stock market would be 5,000 to 10,000 points higher if the central bank had done its job properly. Brexiteers have rubbished the Bank of England and its Canadian Governor Mark Carney's prediction on the economic impact of Britain's decision to leave the European Union. President Erdogan of Turkey triggered short selling of the lira after the central bank started propping up the currency ahead of elections. And while doubts have been cast on India's economic data, the central bank has lowered interest rates just before elections there. All this at a time when the International Monetary Fund has lowered projections for growth to 3.3%, the lowest growth since 2009. Well, joining us here in Doha to talk more about this is Akbar Khan, Senior Director of Asset Management at Al Rayyan. Welcome. So, about the independence of these central banks, it seems that they're under threat from several leaders in the world, President Trump, Erdogan in Turkey, Modi in India, and so on. What do you make of that?
So, Hazim, it's very easy for a politician to want to use the resources of the state to help them get re-elected. It would only be natural. Central bankers have spent many decades in trying to extricate themselves, in particularly many of the advanced economies, from that oversight from politicians, so they can actually do what's best for the longer term of the country rather than short-term populist measures. However, the politics in a number of countries you've mentioned and a few others, we just had an election in Indonesia, that's another country where you've seen some populist policies. the politics of a lot of countries have now meant that you have leaders that are more focused on these more short-term measures, and that has put a lot of pressure on central bankers to try and maintain that independence. President Trump has repeatedly tweeted about how much he dislikes, frankly, the Federal Reserve, which doesn't help them in doing what they're trying to do. So I guess the question is, to what extent can central bankers withstand that pressure and continue to do what they're doing, or, as in some central bankers have found, particularly in India, they get fired.
But there has always been discussion, hasn't there, about the job that central banks do. I mean, during the financial crisis of more than a decade ago, the question was, should they have been spending so much to rescue these banks that were in trouble? I mean, are they clear enough in their guidance? What's acceptable and what isn't?
So central bankers generally work with inflation targets. So they particularly in more advanced economies, they set inflation targets, which is effectively a target for economic growth. After we had the crisis a decade ago, growth collapsed, and if your target as a central banker is to bring inflation up to a certain level, that means you have to get growth up to a certain level, which led them to effectively throw the rule book out and try a whole array of things which hadn't been done before to try and get growth back up. So you could call it populist. You could also call it them trying to meet their aim, which is to have a certain stable level of growth. You could probably criticize them of having not done enough prior to the crisis, which actually led the crisis to happen. So they probably allowed too much growth to happen in the preceding years, which led to the problem.
And as far as the implications of the global economy, we have the IMF warning of slowing growth. What are the main areas of concern for you?
Sure. So the IMF has just announced this very recently, but actually the world economy has been slowing for several months or several quarters, depending on where you look at. So Europe is probably the part of the world which is seeing some of the deepest slowdown. Germany is struggling on the manufacturing economy. Within that, the automotive sector, which has supply chains globally, has been struggling. France is slower. Italy is slower. So Europe has issues. The US, which has been on a very good path, has recently started to slow. An economy can only grow to a certain extent when the central bank has increased interest rates 8 or 9 times of the preceding 2 years until it eventually starts catching up. And also the other issue, which the US economy and the Chinese economy, which is obviously critical, is the trade war and the uncertainty that has brought about as a result of companies both in the US and in China and globally who have supply chains in both countries and have delayed investment decisions, and that has a spillover effect. And similarly, you've seen the same thing happen in the UK and Europe with the uncertainty around Brexit.
And as far as this region, we're here in Doha, and as you know, there is this ongoing economic blockade on Qatar by a number of countries in the region. What can we expect there going forward? Sure.
So the blockade obviously is now about 2 years old, and while that was a shock to the system for the local economy, undoubtedly it would be for any. I think that's very much behind us. The initial issues were to do with supply chains, with for the country domestically as to where inputs were coming from. There was never an issue of exports. I think what's happened is that those supply chains have been rejigged relatively successfully. Some imports have been substituted for local production. The net result is that I think it's very much behind us now. The question is about looking to the future, and Qatar has taken some pretty aggressive steps to announce that it will be actually increasing its LNG output by 40% by the end of 2025, which will cement its dominance of the global LNG industry. That is obviously a very significant benefit and boost. There are a few other milestones that will be coming through before that, expansion of further petrochemical output. And then we have Football World Cup in 2022, which will clearly have a positive impact on the economy probably in the 12, 18 months preceding it. So the outlook is certainly brightening over the next 5 to 7 years, and it leaves Qatar actually now looking at things in a very different light to where they were 2 years ago. Akbar Khan, good to talk to you. Thank you. Now, humanitarian aid and the politics behind it have been at the centre of Venezuela's ongoing crisis. Now, after years of refusing to accept international aid, the government has given the Red Cross the green light to import and distribute food, medicine and hospital equipment for those most in need.
but the waiting list is long. Lucia Newman reports.
This refuge in northwestern Venezuela is home to 67 children and young adults with disabilities who have nowhere else to go. Most of the residents were born with mental retardation, severe autism, or varying degrees of cerebral paralysis, all of which require medical treatment.
If they don't get their medication, they have convulsions or have acute anxiety. They fall down. They're frightened. But there's a severe shortage of treatments, which are unaffordable now. We're all suffering.
The home is run by the Catholic Church with volunteers and donations. Government subsidies stopped years ago. Many families here in northwestern Lara State are struggling just to feed their families and can't cope with a child with special needs. But the institution says it doesn't have the means to take in any more. Like many here, Jairo was born with cerebral paralysis. That's a disorder of movement and muscle tone, which means he is confined to a wheelchair. But if there was proper specialized treatment, physiotherapy, he could probably move a lot better, perhaps even walk. The problem is, there's absolutely no budget for that. In fact, the institution can barely afford food and salaries for the nurses. Even electricity and water have become a luxury in this part of the country. With constant power blackouts, classes are suspended, so therapists do what they can to keep the residents occupied.
We ask, we demand that the government open the doors to humanitarian aid. We need it desperately. There are people dying because there are no resources, no medicine or equipment to treat the ill.
Father Betancourt says that in the 36 years that he's been here, he's never felt so unable to provide for youngsters who have already been dealt a difficult hand. Children like 10-year-old Jonathan Rojas, a bright and curious boy who was born with hydrocephalus. It requires treatment, but under other circumstances, he could expect to live a normal life. Right now, the only hope for him and the others is the arrival of international aid. And as everyone here will tell you, it can't come fast enough.
Now, 16,000 workers at what was India's second largest airline are hoping to save their jobs. Jet Airways has grounded all flights because it's run out of money. Managers saddled with more than $1 billion of debt are trying to find a way to get back in the air. Fez Jamil reports from New Delhi.
They're fighting for their livelihoods. These Jet Airways employees haven't been paid in months, some not since last August, and it's been taking a toll on them and their families.
Education of children are suffering, the health of parents is not taken care of the way it was, because all the insurances and things are all defaulted.
Thought that we might retire from here. You see, here is my son, he's also in jet. He's also flying as a pilot. So if I could have thought of that it will get into this situation, I wouldn't have brought him in this airline only.
Once considered India's premier private airline, it suffered financial difficulties for years, coming close to collapse in 2013 until Abu Dhabi's Etihad Airways bought a 24% stake, infusing new cash and life into the airline. But new low-cost domestic carriers have continued to eat into Jet Airways' market share and profits.
Formally announced the first ever.
And Jet's founder Naresh Goel was forced to step down from the board in March after being criticized for continuing to spend on planes and premier landing slots as the airline's debts were piling up. For passengers in India, the grounding of Jet is expected to lead to higher airfares, but aviation analysts say that'll be temporary.
And India is one of the few growing markets, whereas most other markets in some form or the other are not experiencing that kind of growth. So I don't foresee that more than 4 to 6 months will be required to cover up the capacity gap.
But that's little comfort for the tens of thousands of Jet employees who stuck with the company despite working unpaid.
From the day I've joined in so many years, the airline has given everything to us. And suddenly out of things, a lot of things have changed suddenly. which we really don't know what happened. It's been very uncertain. But yes, the loyalty still remains the same because wherever we stand is because of Jet Airways.
To the government of India.
Many hope their years of service in what was commonly considered a dream job will not have been in vain.
Anyone with a flight booking received a cancellation email early on Thursday. The airline will now have to wait for the outcome of a round of bidding by potential buyers on May 10th to get an idea of what the future may be. In the meantime, Jet Airways employees can only wait and hope the airline will take off again. Fez Jamil, Al Jazeera, New Delhi.
Well, joining me now from Leicester is Withubdesh Kapoor, former head of corporate communications at Qatar Airways and Etihad. Thanks very much for being with us. So many balls up in the air here. The company's former owner, Etihad, TPG, Indigo Capital, all interested in saving this airline. Who's your money on?
Well, thank you very much, Hassan. Basically, obviously, as you mentioned, there's a lot of interested parties, but it's taking quite some time. I think the bidders have until middle of May to express their real interest and put forward a bid. Strangely enough, I mean, we've got Indigo, which is an interesting one, which has interest in other airlines around the world. But my bet, in a way, seems to be on Etihad, my former employer, despite the fact that there's a lot in the press about their investments have gone wrong, collapse of airlines they've invested in. This is an interesting one because Etihad had a lot to lose because they invested in Jet Airways 5 years ago on the basis of entering a big market. India is a massive market. Today it's worth 135 million passengers a year. In the next 2 years, it's likely to increase by 50%. So for Etihad, around 50% of their traffic from Abu Dhabi to the rest of the world is actually Indian traffic. So they have a lot to lose if they don't actually invest in Jet Airways and increase their investment and capture a large slice of the market.
But just taking a step back then for a moment, where did it all go wrong for Jet Airways? And is there a danger that Air India could be next?
Well, if I touch on Air India, that's always been a danger. The government tried to privatise Air India many years ago, and even last year, not a single investor came forward. The reason for that is simple. It's a large entity, heavily unionised, a large number of staff, a public enterprise, and they're just not a very efficient airline. Coming to Jet, I think it all started as far back as 2006 when Jet Airways invested in Air Sahara, spent $500 million cash on Air Sahara, a competitor in the domestic market. Sadly, that airline, that investment failed simply because it was a low-cost airline. Jet Airways invested in a low-cost airline. It was not in the business of low cost. So gradually, their market share eroded as other carriers came into the market. You've had the likes of Indigo, low cost, AirAsia, low cost, and SpiceJet, low cost. And in the last 5 years, you've had another airline called Vistara, a full-service airline, which has come into the market and taken market share domestically, and they are likely to go international. But despite the fact the competition came in, Jet Airways really did not keep up with the times. You have a management there is a very structured management, did not change, did not look at what's happening in the market. Further to that, you've had fuel prices. Okay, fuel prices have actually gone down over the years, but the weak rupee against the dollar has actually impacted revenue.
So why was Kingfisher allowed to fold, but banks are willing to save Jet Airways?
Well, with Kingfisher, it was an airline that was set up by Vijay Mallya, the chairman of United Breweries, many years ago. This airline folded in 2012. I don't think the banks actually realized the extent of the problems that Kingfisher faced. A lot of assets, the $1.6 billion debt that Kingfisher had, huge debt. And banks, as I say, did not realize how much of an impact that would have on the business, how they would be able to recover that lost money. And as we've seen, Vijay Mallya left the country. He's in the UK. He's facing extradition. So it's a bit of a lesson to be learned. And the situation now, there's several things that come into play. We're actually in election time right now, election year. Obviously, the government wants to keep the airline afloat. It's not their airline, it's a private airline. They want to keep Jet Airways afloat, but they can't invest. They've pleaded with the banks. The banks want to recover money. There's $1.2 billion debt, which is waiting to be recovered. That's a lot of money. So the banks, there's a lot of interest in the banks to actually recover that money. And they will go all out to try and recover that somehow, whether it's selling assets. The challenge here is a lot of the aircraft that Jet have are not owned by Jet Airways. They're actually owned by leasing companies. So what you've seen in the last few weeks is those leasing companies have deregistered those planes in the hope of actually recovering those planes and leasing them to other airlines. So that's actually not capital that belongs to Jet. They're actually renting those aircraft. However, to keep the business running over the last few years, what Jet has been doing is been ploughing in money by borrowing money from the banks, by borrowing money from other entities. And that's a challenge. So the banks actually have to try and recover that money in the best possible way.
Withubdesh Kapoor, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
And that is our show for this week. Remember, you can get in touch with us by tweeting me at @HazemSeeker, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. Counting the cost at aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazem Seeker from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.